many of you know this story? No, right? Yeah, I didn't really know it either until I heard it this February. And Rachel Caw-Taylor, who was our moderator and is now our vice moderator, she and I were at Princeton Seminary together as part of the Isaiah Partnership kickoff. And they told us this story. And, you know, it's not in what we call the lectionary, which is this 3-year cycle of trying to hit all the big stories, right? For instance, Easter. It determines when you hear the version of the Easter story from the Gospel of Mark, and when it suggests which year you hear it from the Gospel of Luke, and it has all these suggestions. Well, this story is not there. So before February, if you had asked me about the story about Paul in Malta, I would have guessed that you were talking about something from current events, right? Well, the person who introduced us at this conference and this gathering to this is a professor by the name of Dr. Kinda Creasy-Dean. And then she gave us lovingly, or I don't know, gave us a copy of her book, and it is called Innovating for Love. And this is the main scripture that she uses in this book called Innovating for Love. And I really, really love this scripture now. It's like a new go-to for me. And partially, I think what I like about it is that it feels so different from some of these other scriptures that we have about going through hard times, because we have people who are literally in the midst of things of chaos and all of this is happening, versus what we typically think of as like Moses and the Israelites leaving and they're in the desert, right? Or we have Ezekiel and the dry bones, and these are kind of our big patterns, or Jesus goes out into the desert. But here we have a storm. And while I grew up in the plains, I feel like storms had just a little more resonance for me, because there's stuff happening. There's things happening to the people while we're in this story, and they're trying to innovate and figure out what is going on and where is God in the midst of this really hard period. So I want to retell the story to you ever so briefly, and to highlight some of the pieces that I am finding to be so exciting. And before I do, I also just want to acknowledge that there are parts of this story that bring up very real questions about power dynamics, incarceration, violence, human dignity, and a bit of colonialism. There is a lot here to unpack. And I plan to preach on this passage frequently over the next, couple of years. So for the sake of just giving you one sermon today, I'd like to reframe the story. So here is a retelling of this. Paul, who is a person inspired by Jesus and by God to transform the world, does his best, and he lands in prison. And it's a long story, as Sam alluded to, and he is transferred from one prison to the next, which means he has to go on this journey by boat across the sea and over to Rome. And the voyage is awful. And this huge storm rages for days. And everyone is too scared or sick to eat. And eventually they share this last meal, and they start throwing the food and anything off of the boat that might help the boat stay afloat. And the big boat begins to come apart. And they are headed towards land. They can finally see something that looks like it might be promising. And before they can help their boat steer into this bay, the boat runs aground and literally falls apart. And so everyone finds himself in the water, and some can swim and some can't. And so those that can't find things to hold on to. And that is called flotsam and jetsam. And I also just learned this, so I'm just going to, quick aside, nerdiness. Pieces of the broken ship, that's flotsam. And jetsam is the stuff that they've thrown overboard. Yes. Flotsam and jetsam may be one of those things you've heard of before, like I have, had no idea where it came from. I'm not a sailor, but now you know. So they manage to find their way, to put their arms around this stuff, and it keeps them afloat, and they all find their way to this coastline in this place called Malta. And once they are there, they are met by the people of Malta, who welcome them and show them great hospitality. And the two groups of people build a rapport, and eventually, the Maltese people help Paul and the Romans get back on the water and on their way. Neither group is the same. Thanks be to God. So again, I'm no sailor, but when I begin to consider this ancient story as a metaphor for lots of things, but let's say for God's people, it really starts to open up. The world was rocking along, not perfect, but holding together. Churches rocking along, not perfect, but holding together. Families rocking along. Relationships rocking along, just holding together. You see how fun this can be to use this as a metaphor? Do you see how many sermon possibilities there are? Stay tuned. Not perfect, holding together until they don't. And we can point to moments, say, that rocked our social and political world over the past decade or the past century, or I don't know what's happening in your life, perhaps the last week. And our sailing as a country has not always been smooth, or as a denomination, the United Church of Christ, and we can all point to the pandemic as being one crazy bad storm. And I know that when we came back together as a church, or started coming back together as a church after the pandemic, or after we had been in isolation, I remember saying frequently, when we will not ever be the same. And everybody was saying that. And I was saying it too. We will not come back together and be the same as we were. And I don't think I had any idea what I was talking about 2 years ago. Because I still feel like I'm just figuring out what it is to be coming back together and for things to not be the same. And it's uncomfortable. And I really thought I had gotten through all of that. But since I heard this scripture in the context, literally at a religious institution, one of the big ones, Princeton Seminary, and we were talking about churches and denominations and denominational structures, that's where I want to focus with us today. And so it's easy to point out the similarities between the boat and mainline Christian religion, which is, we all know the statistics, and we churches are no longer at the center of American culture. That should be no surprise to us. And the religious denominational ships of the past have brought us all great comfort. And in some places, progress and social and political tangible wins. And other times we have run aground and caused harm and not lived into our calling. But the point is, these denominational ships have been struggling for decades. And frequently, the support that was once available to us as churches or as individuals is no longer possible. Programs and camps and resources were jettisoned. The era of big boats seems to be something that is no longer possible. They are storm-tossed and taking on water. And the boat in our scripture falls apart, and yet it still provides a means for the people to stay afloat. Some bits fall to the ocean floor, but other bits, they float. And they are repurposed, and they get the people to the safe, dry land. And that piece, that's what brings me a lot of hope. Because it's not that the boat was bad, it's just that it's not what we need in the midst of this storm right now. There are pieces that still float. And those pieces are the pieces that are really exciting to me. For God is doing a new thing with some old things. And in the midst of great chaos, there is hope. And now the ship that we call, or I'm going to call the church, has brought us pretty far. And on this side of the pandemic, I think it makes sense for us to be listening and trying new things, listening for what God is doing that might be new or slightly different. And I would hate for us to miss an opportunity to follow and to try something new. Because when the people, even after all they've been through, they get onto the dry land, they do not end up rebuilding the same ship. They don't just regroup and do it all again. Instead, they meet new people, and they listen, and they receive hospitality, and they show compassion, and they are changed. And eventually, there is a new path to go on. But there's a big waylay station on that island. And that's where, to go back, the Isaiah partnership comes in, which is why I was at Princeton Seminary in the first place. For we, as a church, have been offered an opportunity to go through this process that invites us to listen deeply to God, to think about mission, and to embody the stories of Jesus in new ways, and then to be innovative in the ways that we respond to God's voice in our lives. We are building a team that will come together twice a month, roughly, to work through this curriculum that we've been given, and it is designed to ask us to do some new things. People who've gone through this process before say that their spiritual life and the rest of their life, their work life and their family, have gone more integrated. And it is that integration that makes them so excited about their faith and about church that they are invigorated to be called Christian again and to come on Sundays. And they have just taken great steps in just being on fire for what God is doing and what they are doing with God. Now, there are ways for all of us as a church to participate in time. And the core team will bring, that's doing all of this processing, will bring ideas and will bring, I'm not entirely sure all what yet, but I know that they're going to, because I'm saying that they are, and I've been told that that's part of the process, right? But I haven't been through this process yet. This is a big leap of faith, and I'm so thankful to our council who, when I brought this to us and said, do you want to go on this adventure with Princeton? And they were like, does it cost us anything? No, they didn't say that. It's free. But it does cost us, right? It costs us time, and hopefully it will be something that gives back multiple times over. But so thankful that when Rachel and I have been looking at this, and people, you all, have been asking us, what is this Isaiah partnership thing? And we give these vague answers. That's because it's a discernment process. We don't know yet. We're just going to take one faithful step after the next, or one faithful stroke through the water. I'm not sure yet if we're in the water or on the sandbar yet. Maybe that will become clear over time. But if you are finding yourself, if you are finding yourself, as I'm talking about this process, if you are finding that your eyes light up like mine, and you're like, what is it that Diana is talking about? I hope you'll let me know. We're still trying to figure out who should be on the team and fill all these different roles and so forth, but mainly we're looking for people whose eyes are also lighting up and who want to go do this thing and maybe find themselves on Malta, whatever that means. So let me know. We hope to kick it off in just a few weeks, and we will, again, bring bring who the team is to you in worship, and we will invite us to have worship time that says, "Go team," and we will give thanks and pray over their ministry. This partnership we are starting is on the kind of big, bold, forward-looking experiment. And in many ways, I think a church like ours is a great place for this to start, because it asks us to be bold, and it asks us to be faithful, and to trust that God is working in what might feel like brokenness and chaos, and we certainly don't know exactly where it's going to take us. And yet we know that that's exactly where God likes to work. In the messiness of our lives, that's where God seems to have the most power and the most influence, if we will simply listen and let God lead. So this project, the Isaiah Partnership, is not going to change everything we do. We will still sing and worship and teach and practice and have fellowship events and picnics this summer and go to pride parades and do all of those things that we normally do. And our hope is that the church's mission will always be the same as it has been, which is to make God's love visible. But I also expect that this partnership will help us to live out that mission more effectively. I think that is what faithfulness might look like for us who live and work in Sonoma County in 2023. So let us give thanks for partners in ministry, whether on Malta or Princeton, New Jersey, or right here in Sonoma. And let us give thanks for a God who loves us so much that even a shipwreck does not have the power to deter God's love or God's people from living faithfully.